Good evening, dear viewers. Together with Hanka Lipovska, we welcome you to an absolutely extraordinary edition, just to be clear.
Good evening.
I'll start with where we've spent the past week. We were at a very interesting conference in Doha, Qatar. The conference was called Economics and Security, and we prepared a paper for it, which was presented on the spot by Hana Lipovska. That paper was a mathematical model of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And Hana wouldn't tell you in her innate modesty, but she was a huge success, and her calculations are and have been of great interest to the world's leading authorities. We will, of course, talk about her contribution in a moment as well. I would be very happy for us to introduce our hour or the few dozen minutes that we are going to talk, so that we introduce her by talking not only about what we experienced at the Qatar conference, not only about how today's scientists and research institutes, but maybe even officials from NATO are looking at global conflicts or the threat of global conflicts or even local conflicts. But of course, we are open to your questions, which will be relevant not only to this conference, but perhaps our views on the current political situation, or perhaps what new things we are planning in our own, just to be clear. Before we start with the more technical part, I would like to give an overview of what the conference in Qatar means for the scientific community. Qatar at the moment is a very rich, small country, and a country that practices a policy of all azimuths. This means that they are quite pragmatically maintaining good relations, both with the United States, with Russia, with China, and with the European Union. And because of that, has created an environment where people from basically all over the world have not been afraid to talk about war conflicts. It wasn't colored by particular ideologies. It wasn't colored, the conference wasn't colored by how any country in terms of its politics approaches war conflicts. And I think that created a very, very good atmosphere. So that explains why in Qatar. The conference was hosted by the Organization of Economists, Peace and Security, and was established in 1989, 35 years ago in the United States. Now, Hana, can you introduce the organization?
It was founded basically in response to the end of the Cold War, because it always has been in response to every war, even the cold. Economists have tried to respond in some way and find a way to prevent new conflicts, new wars. So it's an organization that brings together economics, originally only American, gradually spreading all over the world, and today, with the exception of Antarctica, on every continent, that it's trying to explore why we should pursue the economics of peace, how it differs from the economics of conflict. And the primary ground is the economists who are Nobel Prize winners in economics, who formerly worked for the United States administration. There are people like James Galbraith or Jeffrey Sachs, who are familiar to our viewers from the screen, to be clear, and from the free market, or the Nobel Prize winning economist Stiglitz, but also a much younger generation of economists. And if we look at their website, we see that while the ones in the boardroom, the most respected economists here are these American Nobel Prize winners. The younger generation are the Arab economists, Asian or even Russian. So this is a group of economists who are committed to preventing the recurrence of war. And suddenly, just after the year 22, but already after the year 1014 as well, it began to have a renewed impetus to develop racing activities.
I can disclose, when we arrived at the place and the first sort of evening started, when people were getting acquainted, we were very surprised which countries and which workplaces were there. Professors of economics, and not only economics, professors of various social sciences came. So can you give us an idea of the countries and departments from which we met our colleagues there?
For me personally, and I think for you as well, probably the most important thing was that economists from the United States and Russia, economists from the Arab countries were there at the same time, and economists from countries that are very strongly behind Israel. Indeed, this was also the reason why Qatar, a very unusual destination, was chosen this year, because usually this annual conference is held in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, for example. But it was, as I understood from the organizers, when we made the arrangements and when we were invited to speak, it was a problem to get countries that would let economizations from all the hostile parts of the world at the same time into their territory, which Qatar was. And that's why there were people who, for example, are professors or even vice chancellors of defense universities, for example, in the United States. The Defense University, which is supposed to train career senior officers for the United States Navy, is an example. This is essentially the elite of the US military. Similarly, the defense universities in the Low Countries, the Royal Defense University in Belgium, but conversely also, for example, economists from Moscow, Indonesia, India, or even from Korea or from the Vatican. So really a very testing group of people. And then, which we were still represented this time, the Czech Republic.
The Czech Republic was represented not only by you and me, where you were there as a teacher at the College of Finance and Administration. I was there as a member of the scientific council of that school, but there were also, I think, colleagues or a colleague from Masaryk.
A Slovak colleague who is currently at Masaryk University at the Faculty of Social Studies, the faculty from Piat, so he and Prime Minister Fiala, who despite this participated very actively with his contribution to the Peace Economic Conference. So we can see that sometimes the feeling the Prime Minister might say narratively that Masaryk University is against the peace initiative may not be true, that even scholars from Masaryk University may join in.
We have come there from an atmosphere, let's say, Czech or EU atmosphere, which is in favor of support, let's say, the war in Ukraine, not only in the form of humanitarian aid, but also in particular support for the import or export of weapons, the supply of weapons to the battlefield. And we agreed that the thing that struck us most about the whole conference was that these people, those distinguished professors from basically all over the world, were there talking not about the economics of conflict, but about the need to educate people, to create education for peace. You're a university educator yourself, so how would you interpret that atmosphere where they were saying that we need to teach about peace and not war?
Primarily, and this is very uncharacteristic, it was a really professional conference dealing with professional issues, which we will certainly talk about. And yet the organizers from an Arab country, the Qatar Institute for Lifelong Learning, decided to include 1 2-hour session discussing just how to teach the economics of peace, which is a separate, not very popular discipline. And I was impressed that those newer people and representatives just from defense universities around the world were very strongly critical of the fact that they were talking about the economics of war or the economics of conflict, that if the economics of conflict is taught at all in universities anywhere, it's taken as the economics of war and the economics of war, but that it is far more important to teach the economics of peace. In addition to that, there was a discussion of how to teach, by which textbooks, what curriculum, how to test students afterwards, and what economic knowledge such students should have. I was so pleased to hear from a professor at Washington and Lee University in the United States, which is a private university, very prestigious, the 9th oldest college in the United States, which is, as they proudly say, older than the American Constitution. And she said, if we want peace, teaching the economics of peace is preventing war. Whereas if we teach the economics of conflict, we automatically educate new generations to take conflict as a date, as a given, as something that is normal, that we want. And this was the main idea, that we should want to teach the economics of peace, because by doing so, we are setting up a completely different train than when we teach the economics of conflict.
There was also a very interesting model from the Vatican University mentioned in this context, which was the juxtaposition between state spending on arms and state spending on education. Can you explain that? And can you also explain how you calculated that for the Czech Republic, where the Czech Republic stands?
He was a professor from the University of Italy, which is the largest and oldest Catholic university in the world, who has long been involved in the economics of peace, and who opened his lecture by quoting the first Nobel Prize winner in economics, who shortly after the Second World War, in his book, which incidentally was translated into Czech sometime in the 1970s, wrote that the primary task of politicians in creating economic policy of the state, i.e. in drawing up the state budget and managing the economy as such, should be to strive for world peace. That if politicians do not strive with their budgets to make their economic policies, then their work is useless. So he began the lecture by creating a very simple benchmark, one that should occur to all of us: the ratio of government spending on defense to government spending on education and training. And of course, in some states, the budget has a large share of education spending because the schools are paid for by the state, so to speak. In others, of course, education is more private, but that's why the ratio is important. That's what we're interested in. How much more important is it for the state? Defense. And there it was said many times, let's not talk about defense, let's talk about armaments, let's talk about offense, let's talk about war, let's not play at it. It's a defense industry, it's an arms industry. That is, how much money goes to the ministry that deals with this power sculpture and how much goes to education and training. And they took it as a ratio of whether the country has a chance of raising a generation that will be, he put it nicely there, ennobled, because it won't be about war. Because he said, if the generation is educated, if the generation enough conscious of cultural values, of art, of humanity exactly, then they won't want to go to war, they'll look for diplomatic solutions. And we very quickly calculated the same thing for the Czech Republic, and of course it shows that we started at a ratio in the year of the new millennium, when the ratio between defense and education was almost 1-to-1, incompletely, but almost, which is not a very optimistic ratio from that point of view. But as time went on, we got to the point where we were giving to education, for example, 3 times as much as to the Defense Department. But after the start of the war or the open conflict, I'm not taking year 214 now, the open conflict in Ukraine, that indicator has deteriorated very sharply and is now basically at an all-time low, which means we're going around in circles. In order not to have war, we would have to educate first, because war is not normal, it's not okay. But the more we have wars, the more we educate, or we repress education versus war. There is one more important thing here, that of course, both on defense and on education, large sums of money are put into iron or into houses, to housing, to buildings, but not to personnel. And that is why he suggested, let's look at the ratio of how much is given to manpower, that is, to fighting men, officers as such, and how much to teachers, and we should say cook, janitors, the ladies at the click, and let's count up this new indicator. They are already trying to do it, it's not easy. In terms of methodology, we for the Czech economy will also try.
If I'm not mistaken, in Italy there is also a textbook that will be translated into English in the near future, so it will be more numerous.
Yes, it is also important because today there are only English, not Czech, textbooks on the economics of conflict, but as in the United States, in cooperation with economics from the Shea and Turkish, some African universities, not only textbooks are already being written, but basically test files, suggestions for teachers on how to teach. And it is with the initiative of these people that an international platform of teachers is being created, who want to teach economics as an economics of peace, not as an economics of conflict. I hope that we in the Czech Republic will soon join in. I have been doing conflict economics, so let's say peace economics, not for 10 years, but I know that sometimes, to be clear, and the free market are looked at by colleagues from other universities. So really, it turns out that teaching peace economics doesn't make one a desolation, but it connects with people who work at the most prestigious universities in the world.
Before we move on to the next topic, which was terrorism, I would just like to point out one thing. You have also adopted that after the outbreak of the Russian-Ukrainian armed conflict, the word arms industry really disappeared and was replaced by the word defense industry. These are the very terms that then sow a certain bending of, shall we say, that very reality. And to be clear, we try to pay attention to these phenomena and we try to call things by their real names. And it was really refreshing to hear from other people that the words defense industry is really just a repainting of the cruel and for some perhaps unnecessary arms industry, and that it is just a figure of speech.
I will allow just one brief recollection here. 25 years ago, I heard an interview with a Czech war veteran, I think the years I did Air Force, and I forget the name, I forget the circumstances. And he said a terribly clever line. He said he thought it was a breakthrough that we started using the Department of Defense instead of the War Department, that there was a renaming of that budget chapter. I think that's a really important thing, and in the same way, we should now stop calling war peace and hate love and start calling things real again, names, and get back to
where we want to be.
So
I promised the audience that we would talk about terrorism. So at that conference, they also discussed models of terrorism and its spread. And that's where we learned that there's a rather sulfurous phenomenon whereby Western citizens go and get recruited into Islamist countries, and in their names, in basically only and exclusively for money, they are willing and able and end up carrying out terrorist activities. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I would just preface it by saying that this model is really a statistical model, a mathematical model, to say the least, was presented by a Federal Reserve researcher from the Federal Reserve Bank of America. And you're right, at its most famous branch in Louisiana, the so-called Fred. Again, many economists who listen to us will still recognize it as the basic best source of data that we have available in Western civilization. That is, a person who works directly for the US government, a person who, if the view that is shared here were valid, that just peace is a heretical idea at this point, that we must win the war now at any cost. A person who shouldn't be in quotation marks at all shouldn't be dirtying up a conference like this. And he made one of the, in my opinion, the most interesting contributions he ever modeled there. What pulls leaders or citizens from Western countries like Sweden, France in the opposite direction than we would expect to Islamic states where Islamist movements are winning, and then what can cause them to go back and set up terrorist cells back in, say, France or Sweden. We have known the opposite proves until today. We have known Islamists trying to infiltrate Western European countries or the United States. There they try to launch a few terrorist attacks, and that is the end of it. But his model is proving hard that, first of all, those Islamist states, and especially those terrorist movements, use very clever marketing where they can lure you in with the promise of really high wages. Please to high wages, to high grief. These Western European citizens, in another way, they are not trying to fanatize by saying that if you join us, you get eternal life as a suicide bomber. But they're saying, look, you've got it much worse in your country, or you're on welfare, you're not respected, you're marginalized, and we're offering you a great job, great money. So if you come over to us, you're going to be better off. And then he modeled not only what to do to stem the tide, so how to change the social system in the source countries, for example, and how to change the wage system in the, he said, source countries in France, in Sweden. And he also said, okay, but once they escape us and join the Islamists and get hired as mercenaries, how do we make a backstop so they can't go back? Which everybody there, especially those American economists, thought was the biggest problem. But it has to be said that this issue was really addressed more by the Western economists, that the Arab ones were looking at it as well. So you in Europe are dealing with Ukraine, but here we are dealing with Yemen, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea. What you pick out as one huge war that you are living through, we are absolutely not interested here because we have been here for decades and you have never cared about them. It was tremendously important, at least for me, to see that there can be a completely different perspective than the meaning of wars than the one we see from Prague.
I should add that a number of the papers also dealt with the role of the North Atlantic Alliance, dealt with the stowaways in that alliance. But what was interesting was that there was such a big analysis of how arms spending varies between countries, where there's a minister from the right and where there's a minister from the left. I'm thinking now of the Minister of Defense. So, Hani, what did we find interesting about that?
It turns out like this. There are a lot of approaches, a lot of colleagues have fought it out there, very different on which approach is right, but generally they say right wing. In our case, it would be ODS. Ministers are more the hawks who are trying to cough up more money for the Ministry of Defense. But that we have seen over the last decade that we cannot just talk about the defense budget package as such, but that the right-wing ones, again, I say in our case, it would be the ODS, are trying to get the money in the iron, typically buying F-bombs or BVPs or in short capital, let's say. Whereas those on the left in our country, we could perhaps say in the sound of, yes, in today's times, I guess in today's division, they're trying to divert that money more into military salaries or even civilian personnel in the military into human resources, because they're creating, or they think they're creating jobs and they're tilting society. But I personally thought the most important thing about it was that these economists from Western countries, after mostly Western countries, took it as a date that there was a right and a left. We, especially after the last two elections in the Czech Republic, keep pretending that the right-left divide is obsolete, that there is no point in dividing right and left, that we should not be arguing like this at all. But clearly America sees, at least among Czech leaders, professors who work for the government, the sense of a division between right and left. So even if we think for the 100th time that it's pointless, we're not going to get away with it. There will be a demand, at least through, say, our government parties, that we see the right and the left as two different groups.
I would like to add one thing, of course, that we were interested in how the Czech Republic will be mentioned in the block devoted to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because we hear from our government officials how important our munitions initiative is. According to some of the press in Germany, the Czech government is rated as the biggest war hawk, basically. And I have to tell you then that we were quite surprised because the Czech Republic was hardly mentioned at all. I think I registered it once, Hani?
Yes, only once in some historical overview, but if my colleagues in the Czech economics had a great overview of the functioning of the Czech economy and Czech economic science, especially from the 1990s, we'll get to that, from the present. The way the Czech Republic is constantly portrayed as a tahona was completely invisible. On the contrary, even Slovakia was mentioned in contrast to us, and of course Poland played a role. There was a young colleague from the Polish Warsaw University of Economics, and he, by the way, also did not emphasize any Central European initiative or Central European space at all. In other words, we are probably much less important in the Ukrainian war than the Prime Minister or the Minister of Defense feels or tells us.
I am going to make a bit of a link between the North Atlantic Alliance and that, how its leaders or American researchers see the role of individual countries in the European Union. As we know, the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas is expected to become the High Representative for Foreign Affairs in the European Union specifically. I would ask you now to bring people up to speed on what we have been quite vocal about there, how Estonia was seen in that scientific chart or that North Atlantic Treaty Organization scientific chart.
A senior professor from a university in Greece came in there with quite an interesting statistical model, quite advanced. We know that Greece has had a very different approach to NATO and to defense and to the defense video for a long time because of the battles with Turkey than, say, Central Europe had, and he was there doing an analysis of the proximity of the countries in the cybersecurity area. It turns out that when you look at those states from the perspective of their security experts, the question is whether they asked, for example, Mr. Fulton here to do that. If you say something in a moment when they do an analysis of the view of their security security experts, it turns out that the overall view is homogeneous on that. We would be in the same group on the one hand with the United States, but also with Albania, which is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but it is affiliated with the research. Then the other group, which would include, for example, Belgium or the Netherlands, but Estonia is a complete outlier, a complete aberration. That Estonia doesn't fit into any of the groups that have been studied there. It doesn't fit into any of the other three groups that have a separate set of one single member. That's fairly typical of those Baltic states on a number of indicators, by the way. They are just really different. With its history, culture, as it has been said many times there, history has meaning and history predetermines it, where we are today or where we will be. And the fact that Estonia is absolutely different from the rest of the North Atlantic Alliance, even in the area of cybersecurity, does not necessarily mean that it is worse or better. And the question is whether you represent a country that is different in every conceivable way, can then be a good spokesman, or let's say a faithful spokesman for those other countries. In the case of the European Union, we know that the EU and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization with its member states significantly.
So Juhani, let us now come to our contribution, which was on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict at the conference. You presented that paper and it contained conclusions that were very resonant. You talked about the role of lobbying, the role of arms interests, and basically how it affects the length of the conflict and the intensity of the conflict. Can you elaborate on that?
The result of our model was that conflicts in general in recent decades, but particularly the Ukraine-Russia conflict, or the conflict in Ukraine as we prefer to call it, has been freezing up. That is, they end in endless cost in lives, endless costs. Instead of leading to a clear victory for one side or the other, because of the interests primarily of the arms industrial complex, which translates into lobbying support. In the United States, we know that the armaments industry finances, with a hand that is both joint and inseparable, Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump at the same time. In our country, we would probably find this. We know that sponsorship by the largest arms groups has been directed, for example, at the Civic Democratic Party. But at the same time, the biggest gun groups have sponsored, for example, President Zeman in the last presidential campaign. So again, insurance on both sides. And in other words, that until the states deal with just the lobbying and the gun industrial complex interest groups, there are two interests: that conflicts don't end and that new conflicts arise. If we look at this more closely in a moment, I will just say one thing. The reaction that we got to this post afterwards, during the coffee breaks, during the evening meetings, was very unusual for me personally. I've been to a lot of conferences, but I've rarely had non-conference industry stalwarts come up and thank me for a paper. And when I think about why, it was important to them that something that we all feel, that there was just a problem in the arms industry lobby, was confirmed and illustrated by a mathematical model, because after all, that's what we're used to, that what's proven by mathematics can be said out loud. So the reaction, for example, even for the Chancellor of the Defense Research University in the United States was usually warm, but I would have expected it from her to be quite hostile.
But you also offered a way out. There were a lot of starting points
discussed. It was a matter of saying, well, we've got to take the honey bowl away from those ants, because we know that where there's honey, there are ants. And if we take that honey away, the ants are out of luck and they're gone. Well, we've got two options. One option would be to introduce an info tax, which we know so well from the energy sector, just on the arms industry. Let's say prohibitive taxes that would still siphon off most of those excess profits, so that one day the armorers wouldn't be so interested in continuing a long conflict. That would show up nicely. Well, the second thing, the more provocative one, would be the outright obsolescence of the arms industry, which is also not new, but there was a very interesting counter question then about whether that can be done if the conflict is already underway, and what to do to make it non-preventive, but to mitigate the war, to throw stones in the gears now, or to end it. And I believe that it will, but I hope that the reaction that it has generated will make them take a look at it, even in those Western countries, my colleagues.
Not to talk only about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, it should be said that there was talk of conflicts in different parts of the world. Of course, in informal discussions, we have noted one really big threat, which we have subsequently investigated, and unfortunately, it is supported by facts. In particular, Professor Todd Sandler from the University of Pennsylvania, what was it?
We know that for a long time there have been whispers about the possibility of a war in Taiwan. Officially, it is taken as a China-Taiwan war, which of course is a nonsensical sentence, that China would invade Taiwan at a time when Taiwan is also seen by the Czech Republic as part of China. That's like saying the Czech Republic invades Moravia. But on the other hand, there is talk of the possibility of a conflict involving Taiwan. And when we asked those American colleagues, they were very serious and they said, unfortunately, yes, unfortunately, it is true. And we are even seeing preparations right here in our cities, because in the last year, large factories have started to be built to replace the goods that we have been using, either from China or from Taiwan. For example, the chips, exactly, and there is even public talk that this is the reason. Well, and of course, such a conflict can't turn out very well about that. That's why they took it this seriously. Interestingly, if we look more into the literature, there is a lot of talk about a date by 2027 or 2029 that the American political scientists are trying to point that, beginning to the fact that China is going to start a conflict, and that that conflict is going to be a celebration in sections, the anniversary of either the founding of the People's Army of China or the anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. However, we know that this conflict is still avoidable and will probably depend very heavily on the outcome of the US election. However, the way they have approached it, they are not that interested in Ukraine anymore, and they have said that we have to take the situation between China and the United States, unfortunately, very, very seriously.
They basically said that the question is not whether the conflict will happen, but when the conflict will happen, which really sounds like a very, very scary reactor.
Because our country here a few years ago, whether through the president of the Senate or the Speaker of the House, or ultimately the first actions of President Paul in a moment, when he was president-elect and he was already on the phone with the ambassador, the so-called Ambassador Kaiban, we know that we have actually taken sides here. Or we didn't take one side, we took the side of the football field where the conflict is supposed to take place. Maybe if we took at least one side, we could win the game, but if we take a stand right on that battlefield, well, the battlefield loses, right? One side or the other may win, but the battlefield always ends up mined and destroyed.
I would pause before we give the floor to our viewers on the atmosphere at the conference. You've been to a lot of conferences, after all. I've been to a few, and we've been seeing a lot of that lately. That questions are being asked through all sorts of apps, that they're being asked anonymously, that they're basically too much of a live face at these conferences. The face doesn't debate, doesn't shake those ideas. So how did you feel about the atmosphere in Qatar, in Doha?
What really struck me, as much as it sounds like a phrase, and it's not a phrase, it was a world of lively discussion, where every contribution aroused a huge amount of interest, where you could see that everybody did, who was supposed to give a lecture after someone else. Then they tried to somehow connect their lecture with what had already fallen, to transform it, to incorporate it into the text. And that really, the discussion wasn't for form. It wasn't for everybody to have a comma that they'd done a talk and an article in a publication, but that there really was a huge effort to aspire of the vast majority of those colleagues to solve the problem, to solve the question about the conflict. I was almost moved there by how economists from just those hostile states were already able to work together. The Russian economy itself came up, which saw very well that I said from the Czech Republic that she had lived a short distance from the Czech embassy for a good chunk of her life, and thus saw that at this point we were nominally, from the point of view of our states, from a hostile country. But she was talking like the closest colleague from any other university. In other words, the fact that it is still the case that scientists are willing to talk together, to discuss together, that was very strong there, and I think it was due to that sense of threat that we all live in today, and very nicely put by Professor Sandler of Dallas, that such universities have been such conferences have been much wiser in recent years, happening just in the Farrapan states or in the Asian states than in Europe. Because he said that in European countries, on the one hand, the same type of people who are conventional, who are afraid to say anything, are still coming out, that someone else might accidentally overhear. And secondly, that if it's more plastic, when there is a preponderance of just people from countries other than Western civilization, we stop being so hypocritical, we listen much more, we become much more aware that we are not the center of the world, not by a long shot, even that we are now the declining part of the world, not the rising part. And thirdly, that we are much less afraid to talk about friction. In other words, as he said at the end there, let's do conferences like this in Africa, in Asia, or in the Farrapian world, but let's not do them in Western Europe.
Thank you so, dear audience. Now we have talked for 30 minutes. We have talked about it, what we experienced at the Organization of Economists for Peace and Security Conference. We, of course, wish that the economics of peace would start to be taught here as well, and maybe something can be done to that end.
So before that, are they your elders?
We will try to do that, and maybe the new textbooks and new ideas will come to us too, and we will not be talking about war and conflict all the time, about arms and the need to defend ourselves. And now I ask for your questions, please, in the overhead.
Ano, dnes, jak vidíte, tak nejsem v režii já, ale je náš posádcí pan kolega, takže máme štěstí.
Mrs. Eva Kolářová, good evening. Was there anyone else from the Czech Republic at the conference? Thank you for the information. Yes, there was a doctor from Masaryk University. He was a Slovak colleague. And Hani, you have, I think, his name and where he was at that university.
Velmi zajímavé, protože pan kolega Chovančík, který je tady Slovák, který právě v tuto chvíli působí po mnoha svých misích ve Finsku, byl i na
Slovak colleague in Canada.
Který zakotvil na Masarykově univerzitě na fakultě sociálních studií, tedy na té mateřské fakultě našeho pana premiéra. Ale co je zajímavé, on ten příspěvek měl s docentem Oldřichem Krtcem, kterého můžete znát z médií spíše jako toho jestřába, řekněme, spíše jako jednoho z těch politologů, kteří mluví mnohem více v tónu české vlády, než v tónu tady těch promírových iniciativ. So, musím říct, že i když jsem tam, já sama měla nějaké výhrady, což je asi běžné, tak právě pan kolega Chovančík i v té soukromé diskuzi měl podle mě nesmírně osvěžující pohled i z hlediska toho, how does he think teaching these particular subjects should or shouldn't work?
Please, another question. Mrs. Renata Jachkova, how were you treated in Qatar and how did you like it there? Well, Hana, you start and then I'll say something.
In these countries in general and in Qatar very strongly, there is really a huge respect for education. So whenever and wherever we explained why we are there, when we pointed out that we were going to be attending a scientific conference in their science center, because they had them all tear down some old buildings in the 90s and build a really new university center. So at that point, it was absolutely changing the way everybody behaved. Before it was coldly respectful, and then it totally changed. The moment I allowed myself to introduce you as a member of the Science Council, they immediately rearranged the signs and put you up front with the Tolu as a more prominent figure. In short, the reverence for education there is enormous. We can only learn. We just saw videos in many museums about why education is important, how important math is, how important science is, and how important humanity is, which I think is long forgotten in our country. I don't know what you mean by that.
Very similarly, I take exception to that. And in terms of that kind of common behavior, we knew we were going to the country, of course, that had its own customs. We knew that the normal and touristy things, that women are supposed to move around with their shoulders covered, with their knees covered. The country is absolutely polite, safe, clean in restaurants and other services. that we've used, whether it's taxis, everything is perfectly functional. Everything is organized in a modern way. A lot of things are done on apps, and they underline what Hank was saying. There's really a huge emphasis on education, and there's a huge emphasis on that as well. That people don't forget their culture. There's really a cross-section of the history of Qatar and a cross-section of the history of Islam. So those are things that are present everywhere, in some of them certainly, but very modern forms of commemoration and their museums and their ways of educating people about it. As we've had the opportunity to see it in the short time we've been here, we thought, well, everybody's had something like that at the National Museum. Everybody there were all these educational interactive maps. We could each play it in many languages. If there were these cross-sections everywhere through those centuries, including what was being produced at the time, what it left for our history. So from that point of view, we were very pleasantly surprised.
I might venture to add that, like those Arab cultures in general, they are cultures that put the child at the center of interest, especially, of course, the sons, but children in general. So I think both of us were intrigued by the way the museums were created, the other educational spaces formed that way, and that local families really went there in their entirety, and that the children were swept away by the exploration, that there was a panel on the history of mathematics, and a little girl, Arab by her clothes, was standing there with her mother, I would guess about 6, 7 years old maybe, she could have been, and she was still fascinated by the video that was running and taking advantage of the interactivity to see the next steps in the history of math or the history of chemistry or whatever. I know that our National Museum, under the leadership of its director, has made a huge step, a huge leap in the last 10, 15 years. It is much, much better at the moment than we could have imagined, but I can see the great house with the great facilities and the good curators, but I miss the excited kids with their mums and dads who go there on Saturdays.
I have to say that basically in that Qatar National Museum, there was a children's corner next to each exhibit, so the adults could browse, I don't know, I'll say sharks, vertebrates, other fauna. And next to that was a corner quite large where it was explained in a child-friendly way, just appropriate for that young age, what their mothers and fathers were looking at with great admiration in the other room. And this was basically at every exhibition, whether it was devoted to zoology, history, botany, or even history, let's say, dressing.
Infestation about education as such, because they know that sooner or later Europa and natural gas, they were very lucky with natural gas, that they discovered it in the year when the protector, Great Britain, withdrew, when they stopped being a protectorate and started being a sovereign state again. But they know that it can run out at some point, that prices are volatile, that it's not exactly best to rely on Europe and natural gas alone. And so they started to look into it. But please, back in the year 1019, how to use AI and start teaching AI in primary schools, especially in maths, in calculus, where they teach algorithms to children from the lowest grades, which is also important, because of course there is almost a caste system in that country. We'll probably get to that. But on the other hand, education is free for all who are residents in healthcare, which means that really children, even from the poorest families, have been getting the basics of algorithmization for artificial intelligence since the year 1019, when it was a subject of exclusive interest to graduates of technical universities, and when it was not talked about in our politics.
So for them, it's a field that's basically part of the mainstream education, a matter of course, a matter of course.
Still,
we'll ask another question. Mrs. Stepanek, was it difficult to get accreditation for the lecture? And who organized the whole thing? Well, it was organized by economists for peace and security. And in terms of the process of getting into such a conference, Hana, you described that.
Thank you. I say about 9-10 years ago, I just started doing peace economics, economics of conflict in my academic work. It was part of my doctoral dissertation, and this spring I was corresponding with some colleagues in the field because my international publications dealt with this area, and just one, instead of the president of this society, was excited about the publication and asked me if I wanted to come and possibly speak here at the conference and offered me membership. So I stayed on as a member of the security group here, where Nobel Prize winners in economics or Professor Galbraith are on the board. I confess that we were not sure at the time which topic to take from what we were dealing with in the field of peace economics. I had several topics. Then you basically chose the sectional one. We were picking. They had the results first written down. When the research was sort of coming out, I consulted, I admit to this, just with Professor Galbraith as Nestorin of the field, by far the most experienced person in the field. And given that he was very encouraging of me to try and send it in, he thought we had a very good chance of succeeding. We finally had the courage to hang the so-called, so that we didn't just go there to listen to the conference, but we had a chance to really participate in the discussion, and it worked out, which for us is a great success. But of course, out of those dozens and dozens of texts, they really only chose a handful in the end. And it was a great honor for us not only to be there and also to be included on the first day in the second panel, which is not exactly usual for this type of conference.
Thank you. I would ask for another question. Will the conference you attended have any practical impact on ending wars, or is it all just theoretical? Well, I think that's a question that was present everywhere, and that was sort of more widely known there. What do you think, Hana?
Of course, the conference itself, the results as such certainly cannot and will not have an impact. That's too ephemeral, but the fact that people who often work in the administrations of their countries or even multinational companies, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and there were also representatives from Spira, which collects data, is very well respected in this, just on war conflicts. And so I think that just by being people who get some information and context there, and then they are heard further back home, because they're in advisory roles in their governments and administrations, so it can have an impact. And I would say one in that whenever people even from the hostile parties meet on an informal basis, then at least the Russian economy will always realize that that's not the case. That all the citizens of the two countries hate each other, that those at the top are simply playing a game, but at a level lower, that the situation may be different, which I think is exactly what may not lead to the end of the war, but it may lead to the fact that when it does happen, we believe it will happen, the end of these conflicts, that normal relations can be re-established, that there won't be a block in which the Russians say, you've been nasty to us, that's why we won't cooperate with you. We would say, you shot, so we won't send students to you for internships, but we will remember and say, okay, we met at conferences, let's draw a black line while we work together. We need it.
You know, and he's also still there. One, in my opinion, important aspect. We've been living under a massive onslaught here in the Czech Republic for more than 2 years. Let's say one-way propaganda about what's going on. And I think it has been very refreshing, not only for us, but also for the economy of other countries in the European Union, for example, that you can talk about war in a way that you have to talk about peace. It was also very refreshing that suddenly things were being called by their real names, that the arms industry was again the arms industry and not renamed the defense industry. And I think that also played a big role, because some people left with the idea that basically this had opened their eyes. We don't know how far they're going to apply that in their workplaces. We really don't know. But every epiphany like that, that information highway or that teaching highway, doesn't have to be a one-way street. I think it can lead to that maybe next time those elites will behave in a different way than they do now.
To that, maybe one more comment. An Italian colleague there had a very interesting post on this about the impact of war on food security, on poverty and on hunger, and he completely turned it around from our often personal view, where we see, yes, the war is draining our resources, we're paying for the downgrading of our pensions, we're paying for the underdevelopment of our country and so on, but he was showing how conflicts are causing famines in the very poorest parts of the world, which I think is something so much more serious, so much more alarming, that it should also change the perspectives of, for example, people from those defense universities in the States, or while those Americans, except for one well, were relatively rational in my opinion. But those representatives from the defense universities in the Benelux, from Belgium and the Netherlands, I think they came there in a more Western spirit. We'll show you now how it is, and there's nothing to it. And I felt that by the end of that conference, they were speaking in a very different way, in a different tone. I don't know how you felt about it, but I sensed a big change in their thinking or behavior.
Very similar. I'm going to ask another question. Jerica, did anyone there address the global green fate or the carbon footprint of warfare?
Not the green fate, but strangely enough, the carbon footprint was mentioned in one paper there when it was related to a model, I think, to the purchase of weapons, if you will, of fighter aircraft. Someone illogically put in as a transformation. That counts the carbon footprint, and it has to be said that at the time it came up, the audience laughed and the professor said a little guiltily, well, I didn't have it there, but I was told at another conference in Belgium that I should try and put it there, and so I did, and it's irrelevant anyway. It doesn't belong in the model, and the reaction of the Arabs in particular, of those colleagues from Egypt or Qatar, was really a laughing stock. So really, I think I'm going to allow an unkind expression here. We're fooling around.
Another question. I studied economics 35 years ago, says Mr. Thomas, but I never came across the term military economics and peace economics. Can you recommend any literature?
Here in this country, very few people have really dealt with it, but I would always start with the post-World War II literature. John Maynard Keynes, that's his very famous book, The Economic Consequences of Peace, which I read in 1929, and also the famous economist Pick from the same time, who dealt with the economics of peace, the economics of war. We find the first books in this field in 1919. And then after World War II, it's primarily an economic book or a selected topic. The selected chapter of Jan Tinbergen's economic policy, he is the first Nobel Prize winner in economics. And nowadays, the author who will be translated is Professor Roussel. His book has more, as we said, for the end of the summer.
Yes.
English, so it's more accessible, and I'm just doing a quick search here because I'm sure I'm going to whine about the name, which I apologize for, but feel free to put Professor Silval from Washington University in the description of today's chapter, who not only prepared the textbooks, but has a very organized structure of handouts, teaching materials we've arranged, that she's going to make it available for Czech universities, so I can put it under this our posting on it for the clicks, because we're only going to...
For me, just happy to have it spread. I would also like to say that we will definitely put a link to the Economies for Peace and Security. That's the organization that hosted the conference, because you can find a lot of studies and recommended reading on their website, as well as their built-in. Basically on why peace economics should be taught, what peace is good for economics, what peace is good for prosperity, what it's good for security. And these are things that are disembodied, that are mathematically calculated, that you can basically find in one place.
Certainly some larger conceptual paper that encapsulates the economics of conflict and its principles has come out, I think, in the military. And now I apologize to Military Horizons or Military Reviews. In any case, a journal published by the University of Defense in Brno sometime in the year 2009, 2010. That's the only such summary article known to me up to this time. Then there are a few articles. Well, of course, the Mikalety articles are mostly English. They were about, for example, Czech.
I'll ask for another question. Will it be possible to see some of the papers from the conference online? Mrs. Nikola Semotanova asks.
Environment. If the conference was filmed, which I think contributed to the fact that even those Western economists were not so afraid to speak, it would probably have mentioned their behavior if they saw that it was being filmed. However, we generally all agreed that we were sharing for further use just those presentations, handouts, documents, and I think that it would be possible to at least put a recommendation in there where it would go with handle.
And I think also a number of those materials may be published on that particular Economist for Literacy website.
And from that, anyway, we'll make some scholarly articles that will be published.
Please feel free to ask further questions. Zdenek Polednik. What is Mrs. Lipovsky's opinion of the US Fed? Well, honey, tell me. I know him, but tell me.
I will preface this by saying that I was praising the St. Louisiana branch, which the so-called Louisiana branch, Fred, which I think everybody who has studied econometrics likes immensely, because whenever we all looked at the data, the St. Louis Federal Reserve had it. So that's why Fred is kind of our everybody's darling, and we have some sentiment for it because it always had beautiful data. And the Federal Reserve as such there, I agree immensely with the view of one free American economist who said he would very much like to be the governor, the president, they say, of the Federal Reserve, because the first thing he would do is he would initiate steps to abolish it, and then he would resign. And that those would be the only two things he would do at the head of the Federal Reserve. Central banks in general today claim what a sacred, wonderful mission they have. You can't exist without them, but the Federal Reserve itself is extremely juvenile. It's not even like 100 years between us. We know that it originated as a captive group or a captive organization of what were then the largest American commercial banks, which were really in trouble, in great distress, and needed to shift the burden of their problems to the taxpayer, as they usually do. The Bank of England once did exactly the same thing, and that's how the Federal Reserve came into being as a stock company. In other words, it is utterly nonsensical to pretend that central banks are sacred, that they are perfect, that they always know what to do. I think they could be taught marketing, and admittedly, I don't like marketing. I don't have a good relationship with it, but they've been able to inspire people the impression that they were untouchable and not to be criticized because they were a pillar of stability. They managed to build something like Czech television in the media sector, that it must not be touched. And I'm reminded of the famous little book, Private Money in Friedrich by Gustav von Hayek, who only after the Swedish Central Bank had awarded him that so-called Nobel Prize in Economics was so happy to then publish a book in which he suggested that central banks should be abolished. So he already had the Nobel Prize, so he could publish it. He didn't need it anymore. Argentine President Javier Milei was proclaiming it today. I know I once proposed abolishing the Czech TV, and then I was elected to the board, so I'm going to try to propose abolishing both the Czech and Fed central banks. I don't suppose President Paul will appoint me to the board.
Thank you. There's room for one last question, so if there is one in the direction, please send it in. Mrs. Eva Sladkova, what do you think about Orban's trip to Moscow, just so he doesn't end up like Fico? A ball is a huge business for someone. Thank you to all those who speak of truth and peace as the voices of ABE. You deserve a bow and appreciation. Thank you very much, Mrs. Sladkova. We, and I think I speak for both of us, we unequivocally welcome Viktor Orban's trip to both Moscow and to Kiev. We think that neither a ceasefire nor a subsequent peace can be achieved without politicians talking, and we see it as a matter of fact, which is clearly a projection and which is a small step, but which may prove to be very significant in the short term, to finally ending the insane killing that is going on to the east of us. Of course, we have seen the huge negative reactions both from our political scene and especially from the EU political scene to this move, but for my part, I think it is absolutely right that the man who is currently at the head of the European Union has gone into this really hot territory and wants to do something about what he has been saying since the beginning of the conflict. And here I see a complete link between words and deeds, something that many politicians are sorely lacking, and I am glad that Viktor Orbán has taken this step. If he seems to be in danger of being assassinated like Prime Minister Fico, then you may be familiar with our show called We Are at War, which we air with security analyst Jan Schneider, and he has voiced his concerns and those of other experts many times, that of course something similar could happen to other politicians who don't agree with this policy of perpetual weaponization. Ukraine, did you even want any comment on that? I agree, maybe.
2 comments, first of all. I did not understand, first of all, why Prime Minister Orbán went to Kiev, because most of us were saying from the beginning, it is necessary to negotiate with President Putin, it is necessary to negotiate with the Russian Federation, so I have it in my head that it is necessary to go to Moscow. The fact that he went first to Kiev and then to Moscow, I think, was extremely intelligent diplomatically, and I will be Mr. Orbán on a number of other things economically, and this was a very clever move indeed, all the more clever because we know that he met privately with the president a few months before, ex-president, and we will see the future President Trump, and shortly before that with Chinese President Sim, another sure winner in a much more complicated game. Unlike other politicians, he has met with President Putin repeatedly after the war was fought, albeit always on neutral territory from that point of view. But I was intrigued by one little thing there that you have always emphasized in the European Parliament. Prime Minister Orbán would no doubt be able to speak Russian at a press conference. After all, from the generation that learned Russian in Hungary as well, and I was very impressed that he spoke Hungarian, that he spoke the whole press conference. Even if there was a cognitive remark in Russian, he conducted the entire 2-hour press conference in Hungarian in that symbolic midnight manner, because that's the way a prime minister of a sovereign state behaves. And let's face it, Hungarian is not the most widely spoken of languages, so that made it all the better.
Thank you. Thank you, Hanka. Thank you, dear viewers, and let me invite you to a few more shows. Coming up tomorrow, I guess around 5 o'clock, we're going to have a very interesting report on who the standoff movement is sending out. And you'll be surprised, it's the son of the current EU Commissioner Vera Jourova, so he's going to be running as a stand-in candidate for Highlands governor. And of course, you will also be treated to our usual program, which you are used to. That is, on Monday, Kateřina Dostálová will be here with her right. On Tuesday, Professor Drulák will be here with his left. And on Thursday, the free market will be here.
And pay attention, on Wednesday, not Friday, there will be not a legal chungle, but this time, for the first time, the EU chungle of MEP Ondřej Gott, who has cancelled the legal chungle so that he can be with his family and his young children at least 1 day a week. And if nothing happens, it will be premiered on Wednesday at 8 p.m. And next Sunday, of course.
Yes, Mr. Schneider will be here next Sunday and the very popular live stream on We Are at War. And I think we'll certainly have a lot to talk about. So thanks again for your attention and have a good evening.
2 days of dinner and goodbye.